Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta Weekly. I'm Roshan Karyapa. I have with me Abhishek Paul, Nirav Kanodra. Together, we'll take you through the news and events of the week that was. It was a pretty eventful week, a rather somber week, I would say, barring the India England T20 that happened yesterday, which we won quite convincingly. So this week, we'll talk about Prime Minister Boris Johnson's resignation in the UK, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's very tragic death, Twitter suing the Indian government, Sri Lanka declaring bankruptcy amid chaos and riots, and some of the interesting Rajya Sabha nominations that we've had, like Maestro Ilaiyaraaja and PT Usha and more. Hey Nirav, hey Abhishek, how's it going?
Hi, Carrie, doing good.
All good, all good.
Awesome, good to have you guys back. Good to have you back, Nirav, after a couple of weeks' absence. I mean, people have been asking for you.
Exactly one fan.
All right. So moving on, let's talk about the episode that we put out last week. I mean, every time we have Rohit on the show, I mean, it's such a thrill because the guy really, really understands his politics. He understands the numbers, the parties, and the insights that he kind of throws up is just so rich. And even for someone who's not very, very, very invested in politics like myself, I can't help getting drawn in by all of his. Whether it's history, his narrative, and all of that stuff. So we discussed the Maharashtra drama, and we traced its roots to the forming of the Shiv Sena, and then their alliance with the BJP, and what's happened over the years. And we spoke about all of the various characters involved as well, from Uddhav Thackeray to Eknath Shinde to Bala Saheb and so on. Abhishek, what do you think about the episode?
Yeah, as you said, it was fascinating episode. Rohit is knowledgeable about almost all states of India, but he obviously has a special place in his heart for Maharashtra politics as well. He's well known or to be an alleged Shiv Sena supporter, right? So, but it was great listening to him because for those of us who are on the periphery, right, who don't know much about, beyond the headlines of Maharashtra politics, this whole saga brought to for someone like Eknath Shinde, who's certainly not in the limelight as far as national politics is concerned before this event. Things like, the little known or lesser known history of the Thane Shiv Sena faction, right, led by Anand Dighe. So people who don't follow things so closely will not know much about it. He also added the trivia that there's been a new movie made about that called Dharamveer, right? And how, Uddhav was attending the movie and he walked out in the middle of it, right? So things like that only add a little bit of nice color to this whole incident. So I would definitely recommend folks, to go and check this episode out if you are interested in understanding more about, this incident of the Shiv Sena breaking into two factions and the change in government there.
All right, let's move on to the first piece of news for this week. Amidst endless scandals, Boris Johnson has resigned as the Prime Minister of UK. Last week, the British government was in shambles as over 25 ministers handed in their resignations along with dozens of parliamentary private secretaries. The exodus began with ministers Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid resigning, quoting that the public expect government to be conducted properly, competently, and seriously. In his resignation speech outside 10 Downing Street, Johnson was candid in admitting that he had failed to persuade his party colleagues that it would be, to quote, eccentric to change the leader at the present moment. Nirav, this is an interesting time in UK politics. I mean, we did that episode with, Sunil Sharma of the CFOC earlier,
Yeah,
right? And we spoke about some of these aspects.
yes.
But we see that, Teflon Boris has finally cracked.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what has happened is basically every country in the world has the underlying issue about like high inflation and slower growth, right? And this kind of leads to some sort of resentment. And a lot of the smart political parties, they know that someone needs to take the fall. And here, Boris Johnson, apart from his antics, apart from Partygate, apart from shielding like one member of the parliament who was against like allegations of sexual assault or sexual misconduct. I think what has happened is everybody knew that there is a little bit of anger against PM Johnson, and a lot of his cabinet, about over 20 cabinet members resigned. If you see now the betting odds, so there are a lot of people who are in the running. Rishi Sunak is one of them. There is obviously Sajid Javid himself, the former health minister. There is Ben Wallace, who's a member of the parliament. There is also another Indian origin, Goan, who's the attorney general, Suella Braverman. But what has happened is basically Boris being like the fall guy allows the Conservative Party to rule for remainder of the term, right? So what has happened is, instead of like this leading to calling for a re-election or whatever, the Conservative Party has a majority, and a lot of these are like opportunistically, a lot of leaders are throwing their hat in the ring. Rishi Sunak has come out with a video. It's called Ready for Rishi, and that would be quite interesting, because not only would he be the first Indian origin Prime Minister of the UK, also like his wife has an Indian passport, his in-laws are prominent billionaires, Narayan Murthy runs Infosys. So there's also going to be some sort of public questioning that any policy that he conducts, does it lead to any sort of a personal benefit to him, if he's like any pro-India policy. And sometimes what happens is they actually overcompensate on the other side. But the race is far from over. I think there are more than 10 odd people who are there in the race. I think the bookies give highest odds to Rishi Sunak and Ben Wallace. And let's see, I think after Brexit, UK has been in a sort of turmoil, because David Cameron resigned. Then we had Theresa May. There was Michael Gove, who was supposed to be in the running then, and also when Boris Johnson became PM. And now he seems to be in the background. It is a little bit of a turbulent time. This is a chaotic time. But hopefully, I think the parliamentary democracy, this is the beauty of it. There's not so much of one key man risk, and the country can function and move ahead. And also, just adding to it, right? It doesn't change any of the India-UK relationship, because it is at a wider party level. So, like we were talking about the potential India-UK FTA, right? So that those things should continue as per previous timelines. It's not going to be a big political shift in terms of foreign policy. At the top, there's going to be a leadership change.
Yeah. And Rishi Sunak's ratings were pretty high, right? I mean, before that whole thing about his wife not filing taxes in the UK, and, the Infosys offices staying on in Russia, and all of those things came out, I think his ratings were pretty high. Yeah, I mean, it's a interesting time, no doubt, in UK politics. It was interesting that someone dubbed the Succession theme music to Rishi Sunak's campaign video, and that was hilarious.
There's one for Boris Johnson as well. There's one for Rishi Sunak as
Okay.
well. And probably, I don't know, probably for others, I'm not so sure.
Just to add a few things here, right? It's a little difficult to, totally understand British politics, because it's sort of a mix between, let's say, the Indian parliamentary system and the American presidential system, in the sense that while the form and structure of it is more like the Indian system, the inter-party politics is much more like the US system. And so basically every prime minister has to guard themselves firstly from contenders within the party. People are ready to backstab their leader at any opportunistic time, right? And so one of the jokes or memes about the Conservative Party, so the inter-party polling that will happen now, right, to select a leader, is that it's not about who is the most popular that who will win. It is the person who has the least enemies who is likely to win this election. So I think, for example, Ben Wallace is supposed to be one of the prime candidates, and about him, he seems to be from a Scottish background. And so one of the benefits or advantages of him becoming the prime minister, people are saying, is that in that case they can go ahead and do one more Scottish referendum sort of confidently, because with him as PM, it's much more likely that Scotland will vote to remain in the UK. Yeah, I think quite turbulent times in the UK. People are also saying that what, Boris Johnson will not sort of go away from the public limelight at all, right? So he will continue to be an MP, and he'll also he has like a big journalistic background, right? And so he will easily sort of fit back into the whole media landscape once his stint as prime minister is over. One more thing, and which just adding to what Nirav said. So this whole business of prime ministers changing within term happens quite often, unless the party feels that they have no chance, right? So in the early 90s, it was quite obvious that under John Major, the Conservatives were about to lose to Labour under Tony Blair, right? Tony Blair had become a really popular figure. And so at that time, no one really wanted to change because they thought they had no hope. So they wanted to let this guy, right, John Major, lead them to a defeat, because no one wants to become a captain when you're about to lose the next series. But now people are actually clamoring to become the prime minister because they feel they are still at an advantage, right? The Conservative Party is still probably at a better place than what Labour is today. And so they feel that if Boris Johnson can be removed, with him goes all the stench of all these lockdown related gaffes, right? Partying in lockdown, all the public perception blunders that Boris Johnson has probably done. Those image issues can be, dealt with, and then the new prime minister gets a sort of clean slate and is also the favorite to win the next election.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of perception, really. I mean, yeah, and the competition seems really fierce. I don't know. I mean, every time someone mentions Boris, I just think about his really cool remark, right? I mean, you see clips of this on YouTube and so on. The great supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies remark. Moving on Friday last week, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot dead while speaking at a political event. Police investigating the assassination have said the suspect held a grudge against a specific organization. The alleged gunman has been identified as Tetsuyo Yamagami, who is 41 years old, and he believed Abe was part of that organization. The man shot him twice with a homemade gun. This has shocked the entire country, where gun crimes are rare. He was killed while campaigning for his party in the run-up to upper house parliamentary elections on Sunday. India declared a national day of mourning on the 9th, and Prime Minister Modi penned a heartfelt tribute, noting, "I will always be indebted for his warmth and wisdom, grace and generosity, friendship and guidance, and I will miss him dearly." Abhishek, this was such a tragic event. I can't think of too many international leaders who have garnered this kind of a emotional response from Indians. Abe-san was seen as a great friend of India's, right?
Yeah, I think a very tragic event. It's hard to imagine an assassination happening in broad daylight in Japan, right? A country with very, very strict gun controls. And ironically, the weapon used is like a homemade gun, what we call a katta, right, in Indian parlance. Quite tragic to see Shinzo Abe passing away so untimely, right? So even though he was not the prime minister anymore, he continued to remain the most prominent and largest figure, right, in Japanese politics. He was campaigning for the upcoming elections, which shows you he was still active in politics. He was still active in guiding and leading his party. So yeah, I think his legacy will remain. Writ large, right, in terms of the impact he's had on Japanese society, Japanese economy, as well as foreign policy around the world, right? So just a few important points, if I may say, before Nirav can also add on it. So number one, his legacy will be in terms of Abenomics, right? He had a very short stint in around 2007 and all, but I think his larger reign was from 2012 onwards. And basically, the background was that Japan had a very slowed down economy which had slowed down. Growth was anemic. It was often there was deflation in the economy. So he basically brought together a set of policies which is popularly known as Abenomics, right, which helped in reviving the Japanese economy. Basically, there were three components to it, right? One of the targets was to generate a moderate amount of inflation, right? Let's say 2%. For that, he wanted to he printed additional currency that made Japanese exports more attractive as well. Second, he brought out a number of government spending programs to stimulate demand and consumption. And finally, he did all the hard work on the reform front, right, to make Japanese companies and industries competitive once again, right, bringing together some of the best practices around the world, right, in terms of hiring and firing, special economic zones, and so on. So all this helped in turning around the Japanese economy's trajectory somewhat, right? And for that, obviously, he'll be well regarded. The second is he was a very involved prime minister when it comes to foreign policy, right? He changed the trend in terms of Japan's very passive foreign policy and purely being a sort of vassal state of the United States, right? Post the Second World War, he recognized the threat of China and North Korea, and therefore he tried to get the defense spending up for Japan from its very low 1% of GDP levels, right? Because of the threat facing Japan from China and North Korea. He is known as one of the father figures of Quad, right? A topic we often talk about on this podcast. And he also is also someone who has sort of brought the Indo-Pacific term into existence, right? Earlier, the whole paradigm was about APAC, right? Asia Pacific. But he enlarged the concept by bringing in the Indian Ocean and India into the picture as a strategic zone which needs to be free and open. So credit goes to him for that as well. Finally, he was a very big, let's say, friend and fan of India as a country, right? Across two prime ministers, right, Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi, he's helped develop the friendship and relations between India and Japan from his contributions in 2007 to help kickstart the revival of, let's say, the Nalanda University project, to his recent work in developing the Quad, right, to his various visits to India, right, including, let's say, the image that we have of him visiting, doing the Ganga Aarti, right. I think the Japanese people in general and Shinzo Abe in particular recognize the civilizational connect between India and Japan. And so, with him at the helm, I think India Japan relations became very smooth and much more warm. There are so many infrastructure projects in India today which have extremely good Japanese funding to thank for, right? Including the bullet train and others. So, yeah, I think Indians definitely felt sad on the passing of Shinzo Abe. His presence will definitely be missed by all in this sphere. And yeah, a really sad event.
Yes.
Yeah, it's extremely terrible.
His critics have said that he's been an apologist for like the World War II events, and he's gone to the Yakinori shrine where the Japanese soldiers were buried. But in the sense, what he's actually pivoted. He says that it is important to have an independent defense strategy and independent policy, foreign policy. That is one major step as well, right? So he's been active member of the Quad. He's kind of pushed the economy.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what you said, I was reading some media reports, and the contrast could not be greater, right? I mean, between the Indian media reports and the some of the American press, press, whether it's New York Post or NPR.
NPR was just incredible, right? So they
Yeah,
first called him an arch conservative, and then
divisive
they
figure.
deleted it, and then they deleted it, and then called him something even worse. They called him an ultra nationalist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the US press coverage was totally bizarre on this.
Yeah, I mean, extremely tragic event, and really, I think one of the folks on Twitter, Naren Manan, had a tweet out saying that one of the NHSRCL stations for the Ahmedabad to Mumbai line should be named after him, and I think we can echo that sentiment for sure, right? Our prayers with the Japanese people, and especially Abe-san's family and friends. All right, moving on. Twitter is taking on the Indian government. They're taking the Indian government to court. On Tuesday, Twitter challenged the Indian government in court over its recent orders to take down some content on the platform. The lawsuit is part of a growing confrontation between Twitter and New Delhi after the Indian government last year passed a new set of sweeping regulations giving it more power to police online content. The lawsuit was filed in the Karnataka High Court in southern Bengaluru city and comes after the Indian government in February warned company executives of criminal action. Well, I think we've spoken about it plenty of times before. It's come up where Twitter kind of behaves like a supranational entity, right, outside of laws and regulations, and kind of selectively adheres to some of this stuff in the Western nations, whereas in developing economies or ascending economies, I mean, they seem to have a different sort of a template and a morale. I think as every company, I think they have to abide by the law of the land and the regulations that the policymakers or the politicians impose. They should not choose to act independently or like feel like they need special privileges and so on. But yeah, I mean, this, I think, Abhishek, this was specific to certain accounts that were asked to be taken down, right? Most notably, I think they asked the journalist Rana Ayub's account to be taken down. Is that right?
Yeah, so I really didn't get into the which account and who, but I feel like Twitter feels right now that it has a decent chance, maybe with how the current state of the Indian judiciary is, especially parts of the Supreme Court, right? Depends on which bench it goes to if it reaches there. Basically, I think their argument will be that the Indian government itself is not, following the laws and procedures it has laid down, right? And it would argue that some of the decisions or calls made by the Indian government are arbitrary or, not justified. I think what it's doing is it's not challenging the principle, but it is challenging on an incident by incident basis, right? Saying that this call or this account is not the correct one to take down or things like that. So also,
Right.
I think as we were discussing offline, with Elon Musk now sort of backing out, the chances are that the Twitter management will remain, we'll see the same trajectory or direction from them when it comes to their dealings with the Indian government. I think now it's incumbent upon the lawyers of
Yeah.
the Indian government to sort of prove that the calls that they have been making are correct and justified in the court.
Yeah, so many of these pull-out jokes on Elon Musk backing out of Twitter, the Twitter deal, right? I mean, that's an interesting story. Actually, I really feel I don't think he was ever intended to go through with it, and especially not after the stock market tanked, right? I mean, all right. After months of economic struggle, Sri Lanka has finally declared bankruptcy. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister told the Sri Lankan Parliament that the country is not only bankrupt, but it has no fuel left. Government employees have been told to stay home due to fuel unavailability. Inflation spiked 54.6% in a year and is expected to hit 60% soon. And transportation costs have gone up 128% in only 1 month. Civilians are struggling to procure basic necessities like food and medicine. Protesters in Sri Lankan capital of Colombo stormed President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's palace last week, clamoring for his resignation. Nirav, I mean, we're seeing some very drastic scenes from Colombo, right? I mean, and you spoke about the reasons for the crisis earlier.
Yeah, so this is far more chaotic than what we had expected. Like we thought that yes, Sri Lanka had some trouble paying back its debts. It was over leveraged, but I guess can't confirm. But also there seems to be like a lot of siphoning off of the money. So what has happened is that the debts which were raised were siphoned off by the elites. So probably Rajpaksha family and others. And so not all of it was even used for development. And now the rest, the citizens are left with these bad debts to pay off. And I think this is like a very, very fragile situation. This also tells us that all the things, right, where we said like how Sri Lanka was fragile, all the top leadership was like one family, and there was no one having any dissent or being able to point out the errors. You had a lot of debt which was taken over, which led to a lot of malinvestment. You had a lot of decisions which were taken without thinking through the consequences, like organic farming. COVID kind of broke the back with no tourism. So you're too dependent on one industry instead of being like a little more diversified. And it was like a perfect storm which has come through, right? This actually tells you about kind of like a warning signal, or maybe Sri Lanka is canary in the coal mine. What has happened is with this Russia-Ukraine war, you've seen global prices of oil and energy go up a lot, right? So that affects the whole world. It is the countries which are resilient and which can withstand shocks will come out stronger, but if you are fragile, you will crack. Second thing is China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, all those loans, they come in with very tight covenants and they're protecting the lender a lot more than the borrowing country. And this also kind of highlights that China isn't like the ally that it seems to be. It seems more like Shylock from Shakespeare who wants his pound of flesh back, right? That in times of crisis, if like the lender also renegotiates the debt and says, you know what, we'll give you like a longer payment time and takes maybe a haircut on the loan, which what IMF typically does. So you are better off borrowing from multilateral global agencies like the IMF. How much ever we kind of criticize IMF and World Bank, they have been a little more easier in previous episodes of crisis, like the East Asian crisis in the late 90s with countries like Indonesia, than like what has happened where like from these Chinese loans. And a lot of countries like Pakistan in our neighborhood, but also like in Ecuador, a lot of Chinese companies, African nations which have borrowed a lot from China, they seem to be quite vulnerable. With the second order effect of the Russia-Ukraine war is higher natural gas prices, which leads to higher fertilizer prices, which leads to higher agri-commodity price, right? So when food and energy, where the demand is very inelastic, their prices go through the roof, the poorest are hit the most. Obviously, this this kind of, we've already seen some sort of a revolution and this mob has gone berserk. It is very funny that there has been an Australia Sri Lanka test match going on at the same time in Colombo, where some people also stormed into the stadium, but thankfully the match went on as usual. I think this is like a big reset for Sri Lanka. Hopefully, India has assisted a bit, but their problems are much bigger. It's too deep a hole to be filled easily, right? So hopefully, as we see some semblance of peace, there should be like a new government which is put in place, and maybe all the other multilateral agencies take a haircut. Also, probably the Chinese banks, which have lent too much on these, I would say, negative NPV projects, where they think that, oh, I'll just invest and they will come. I think they also will have to take some sort of a haircut, and they also realize that rest of the world is not like China, where you invest and you have like a very high productivity and high efficiency, and your return on capital is guaranteed. So I think there's a lot to learn, but definitely it kind of justifies India's decision, where people were criticizing India that India did not join the Belt and Road Initiative. India did not want to be the part of RCEP, right? And because India felt that all the contracts were very much in favor of China, right? And it's not a good bilateral trade if it is very much skewed in favor of one party. And this kind of proves it. And hopefully other nations also learn, looking at Sri Lanka's plight.
Yeah, it's a useful lesson for everyone for sure. In fact, I think Dr. Jaishankar, when he was asked maybe a couple of weeks back or so, rightly predicted that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And it's a fairly complex crisis, right? I mean, I don't know what the way out is. And finally, the BJP has nominated Maestro Ilayaraja, former athlete PT Usha, and two others to the Rajya Sabha. Tamil Nadu and Kerala have remained a challenge for the BJP for long. This strategy might offer them a better foothold in the south, where they have been struggling to make an impact. According to BJP circles in Kerala, Usha and her husband, Srinivasan, had been close to the RSS for long. She was also previously offered a ministerial role in a past BJP government that she declined. The other two persons, also from the south, who were nominated to the upper house along with Usha and Ilayaraja, are film screenwriter V. Vijayendra Prasad from Andhra Pradesh and spiritual leader Virendra Hegde from Karnataka. Abhishek, definitely interesting nominations, all four from the south, right? What do you make of this?
As we all know, the southern India continues to remain a tougher nut to crack for the BJP. And while these decisions in themselves or in isolation have no impact, I think the idea is to continue to create a better perception of the BJP in the minds of the average citizen there. Because in our social media wars, or you call it culture wars, there's always this perception created by a section of the population in South, right? That the BJP stands for Hindi imposition, or it stands for a sort of hegemonic type of Hinduism which is not inclusive, and so on, right? And so it's like a upper caste party, it's a party of Brahmins and things like that, right? These are common stereotypes used by opponents of the BJP to sort of paint them. And so the challenge for the BJP is to consistently keep pushing back and fighting against these narratives. And so I think nominating four very well known, illustrious achievers in the different fields is just sort of a signal or an attempt to create some kind of goodwill among the people of these states, right? And as you said, all of them are very well celebrated achievers in very different diverse fields. And so yeah, I would say it's a good initiative, but I wouldn't say that this translates to anything more concrete at this stage.
Some folks have brought up, Maestro Ilayaraja's cast and everything, but I think the man is so much more than all of that, right? I mean, he rises above all of that because he's probably among the top five best music directors that the country has ever produced, and he's been prolific for like 4+ decades now. I think even perhaps even more. So great recognition of that, I would say, right? And likewise with the others as well. PT Usha, for example, used to be, I mean, is still the doyen of Indian athletics, right? Was a north star for anyone in sports for a long, long while, and such an inspiration for women as well. So each of these nominations, Mr. Virendra Hegde, for example, right? I mean, any place, South Karnataka, if you go there, I mean, you have photos of him at different places. So again, someone who is a remarkable philanthropist, person who's given back a lot to the community, and Mr. Vijendra Prasad as well. All four of them have been excellent at whatever they've done, their chosen professions, vocations, and also, I mean, have that right ideological sort of a bent of mind as well, right, and fairly dharmic. So yeah, I mean, all four nominations are amazing, I would say. So we have a question on YouTube. Harsh Agarwal asks, "Does Sri Lanka crisis have any implications on India, both economically and politically?" Abhishek, you want to take that? I mean, people have drawn parallels somehow, right? Although I don't know how one can, draw parallels between what's happening in Sri Lanka and our economy. Comparing our debt in absolute terms, irrespective of the GDP, or comparing productivity, innovation, our the building blocks of our economy, and so on. What is the lesson from this, and what are the implications on India, in your opinion?
So the lesson or the lesson being taken by the opposition parties is very simple, that use this as a ominous portent to sort of say that what is happening in on the streets of Colombo is what will happen on the streets of New Delhi soon, right? And so this kind of alarmist and almost wishful thinking will continue in some quarters, I feel, right? Because there are these sort of buzzwords that they will throw, right? That you had a quote unquote majoritarian government or an ultra nationalist leaders at the helm who led their country to ruin, right? And so that is the narrative that anyway the opposition has already for the BJP government here, right? And so we will see plenty of that kind of commentary on social media or media, right? I think the lesson for India is to continue to build on the theme of Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? Something we have been galvanized into post the COVID crisis, right? We need to be a resilient country when it comes to all sorts of facets, whether it is our supply chains, whether it is our economy, whether it is our defense, and we are in various stages of it in various spheres, right? So clearly, for example, we have discussed this in the past, right? We are not there yet in, let's say, defense, right? But we are sort of better off in various other things, right? Like food security is much better today in India than at any point in time in our history, right? Energy security is sort of better, right? With our strategic location, with our strategic relationships, we are much better off in many other lines of supply chain today than we were, let's say, even 5-10 years ago. So I think that's the lesson to take, that if you are too reliant on debt, you are too reliant on other countries, right? Then even one or two incidents or events can totally put a country off its path, right? But luckily we are a large country which has sort of large reserves of both manpower and let's say economic power. And so I think I would say that the lesson to take is to continue to be on this keep building up our resilient path in the near future.
Himang Palan has an interesting comment on YouTube. He says, lesson for Indians is to keep electing Modi. Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly interesting, I would say, right? And in fact, I mean, some have criticized this government for being very fiscally prudent. In fact, in the past, right? And we had one famous economist slash politician suggest that income tax has to be abolished and stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah, so if you look at the specific policies, so number one was a drastic change in taxation, right? That is something the government has avoided and we should continue to avoid. Number two was a drastic change in, let's say, the agricultural policy, right? Suddenly doing away with uh, fertilizers and saying that we'll go totally 100% on green farming, right? Those kind of things. And as Nirav correctly said, that's like a canary in the coal mine kind of situation. The thing to learn is that we should not do such things full scale, right? Despite what some environmental activists might want you to do, like Vandana Shiva, right? So, uh, I mean, some of these activists have also been discredited as part of this whole incident, right? People who have had their utopian dreams of green farming have also been exposed in this incident.
Do you think India will step in and actively aid in terms of financial assistance and so on? Because I think one of the points that Dr. Jaishankar also was making some weeks back was, we have done military interventions, right? Whether in Bangladesh and so on, but we haven't really done like a financial intervention. So this may be like the first of that sort, right? I mean, considering that, Sri Lanka is also strategically important for us.
Yeah, I think India has to do as much as possible to sort of stabilize the situation there. But I think there are a few challenges right now. For example, as you saw yesterday and today, people are storming the gates of the various residences of the Prime Minister and President. Obviously, the Rajapakse family is totally discredited now, right? Uh, they had brought in a new Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, to sort of stabilize the things, but even his private home was burned down yesterday, and so he is also resigning. And so, right now, while there is a lot of anger and emotion on the streets, it's not clear as to what is the alternative. Until there is a stable alternative in place, which might be a situation where there is a all party national consensus government, for example, right? Till that is in place, there is only so much that India can do, right? Because with whom will you negotiate and discuss these things in terms of what kind of a package or reconstruction program that you can do for the country? And so, right now, what India is doing is helping out in terms of just the real basics, right? Like fuel or medicines, things like that. But what more can be done will require, firstly, some sort of stability to come in terms of the government there.
Yeah, I saw some wacky theories on Twitter, right, saying that Sri Lanka should outsource its defense and foreign policy to India and become a vassal state. And I mean, few interesting comments on YouTube as well. Himang Palan says, "Can Sri Lanka become a Hong Kong for India? Has the Sri Lankan crisis peaked?" I think so, right? I mean, but although you don't know how much worse it can get going from here. We're going to be doing an exclusive episode on the Sri Lankan crisis. We've been covering a fair amount of geopolitics with Valina's talk. Right, so we're going to do an episode shortly. We'll keep you guys informed. That's it from us for this week. Thank you so much again for joining us. Do stay safe, take care, and until next week, keep watching all of our stuff, sharing all of our stuff, and if you catch us on your favorite podcast platforms, don't forget to rate and review us so more people can discover us. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can reach out to us on social media. We're at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and elsewhere. So thanks again for joining us, folks. Have a great week ahead.